Welcome to the deep dive. We take the sources you're curious about and pull out the most important and, well, often surprising insights.
Think of it as your shortcut.
Exactly. A shortcut to getting seriously informed, without feeling like you've just wrestled a textbook.
And today, we're tackling a really big one, a massive historical shift based on the material you sent us.
That's right. We're diving into Bart D. Ehrman's The Triumph of Christianity, how a forbidden religion swept the world.
A fascinating read.
Totally. And, the goal here, based on what listeners wanted, is to get your head around this huge transformation without getting lost in all the details.
And Ehrman's book, well, it offers a pretty compelling way to do that.
For sure. And for anyone who hasn't come across him, Bart Ehrman is, well, he's a big deal in New Testament and early Christian studies. James A. Gray, distinguished professor at UNC Chapel Hill.
Best-selling author, too. Knows how to make complex history accessible. Years spent in the textual weeds.
Right, textual criticism, early Christianity. And interestingly, his own background, it's quite a journey. From evangelical Christianity to agnosticism?
Which gives him a particular perspective, maybe.
Possibly, but for this book, his approach is strictly historical. He's trying to explain how it happened based on evidence, leaving theological explanations aside.
And the question he asks is just staggering.
Isn't it?
Yeah. How did this tiny group, maybe 20 people, probably illiterate, Aramaic-speaking laborers in a remote part of the Roman Empire?
Yeah.
How did they become the official religion of that same empire? We're talking just 4 centuries later, 30 million followers.
It bobbles the mind when you put it like that.
It really does.
And Ehrman, he really leans into the significance. He calls it, arguably, the single greatest cultural transformation our world has ever seen.
It sounds like hyperbole, but maybe it isn't.
Well, think about it. He argues it reshaped everything in Western civilization for millennia.
Art, music, literature.
Philosophy, ethics, law, economics. I mean, the list goes on. Our entire cultural DNA would be, as he puts it, incalculably different without this happening.
So how does he tackle such a massive question historically? What's the method?
He focuses on sociological factors, how groups work, how ideas spread, also the specific things about Christianity that were appealing.
And the historical context, presumably?
Right.
What else was going on?
Exactly. Favorable events, obstacles, but crucially, as you said, it's history, not theology. So divine intervention. That's deliberately left out of the historical explanation.
Right. He's looking for causes within the human sphere, within history itself.
Okay, so drilling down, what's the core engine driving this, according to Ehrman? What's his central thesis?
Well, he argues pretty forcefully that it wasn't just one thing. It was a very specific and actually quite unique combination. Christianity was both exclusive and evangelistic.
Exclusive and evangelistic. Okay, let's unpack that. Exclusive first, how so? The Roman world had tons of gods, right?
Precisely. Roman paganism was incredibly inclusive, very flexible. You could worship Isis, Mithras, Jupiter, your local spirits, all at the same time, basically. Adding a new god didn't mean ditching the old ones, but Christianity, totally different. It demanded absolute exclusive loyalty, one god, period. If you became a Christian, you had to completely abandon all other deities, a clean break.
Wow. That sounds socially awkward in that environment.
Definitely confrontational.
Yeah.
And then there's the other part, evangelistic.
Meaning they actively tried to convert people?
Yes. There was this built-in drive and obligation almost to spread the message, to bring others into the fold. Ehrman contrasts this with, say, Judaism.
Which was also monotheistic, but...
Right, but especially after the temple was destroyed, Judaism wasn't really focused on large-scale conversion of Gentiles.
Yeah.
And paganism, being inclusive, just didn't have that same convert everyone impulse.
So it's this double whammy, demand total allegiance and actively go out recruiting. That's the key combo for Ehrman.
That's the core of his argument, yeah.
He mentions something about mathematical inevitability connected to Ramsay McMullen's work. How does that fit in?
Right. This is where the demographics get really interesting. Because Christianity demanded that clean break.
Yeah.
Every single convert to Christianity wasn't just one more Christian, it was one less pagan, permanently removed from the pool of worshipers of other gods.
Oh, I see. Because pagans could sort of mix and match, but Christians couldn't.
Exactly. If a pagan started honoring a new god, they didn't necessarily stop honoring the old ones. So paganism didn't lose worshipers in the same way.
So it's a zero-sum game, but only Christianity is playing it that way. Their gains are definite losses for everyone else.
Precisely. So Ehrman argues even with a relatively modest conversion rate, maybe not huge numbers each year initially,
Uh-huh.
this constant one-way flow out of paganism and into Christianity created this relentless shift. Over centuries, the proportion of Christians just kept growing.
Exponentially, almost.
Potentially, yeah. He references Rodney Stark's models suggesting maybe 40% growth per decade, or about 3.4% a year. Whether those exact numbers are right isn't the main point, but it illustrates how steady growth in that exclusive context could mathematically lead to dominance over time.
It's about the percentage tipping over.
Exactly, the relative share of the population.
Now, you mentioned Ehrman pushes back against single causes, so he's not saying Constantine's conversion was the moment it all changed?
Definitely not. That's a key point for him. He argues Christianity was already growing significantly, maybe even exponentially, before Constantine.
So Constantine didn't flip the switch.
More like he poured gasoline on a fire that was already burning pretty well. Ehrman believes the foundations for success were laid much, much earlier by these core features: exclusivity, evangelism, and the efforts of ordinary Christians. Constantine accelerated things, legitimized the faith, but didn't start the triumph.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's go back to that exclusivity thing. It gave him a competitive edge, maybe, but you also said it caused problems.
Right. Big problems, sometimes. That demand for worshiping only one God, it was just alien to the Roman way of thinking about religion.
How so?
Well, Roman religion, paganism, it was flexible, accommodating. You could add new gods. Local cults coexisted with state ones. Christianity's our way or the highway approach. That created really sharp boundaries. Us and them.
Which probably created strong bonds within the group.
For sure. Strong identity, strong community. But it also led to suspicion from the outside.
Because refusing to honor the traditional gods was seen as, what, disrespectful, dangerous?
Worse than that. Often it was seen as atheism. Seriously. Because the Roman idea was the pax deorum, the peace of the gods. You kept the gods happy through rituals and respect, and they kept the state safe and prosperous.
So if Christians refused to participate.
They were seen as actively threatening that peace, potentially bringing down disaster on everyone by angering the gods. That's a major reason they faced periods of persecution. They looked antisocial, even subversive.
Got it. Okay. And the evangelism part, how did that work in practice? Was it all preachers on street corners?
Not primarily, according to Ehrman. Yes, Paul's missionary journeys were crucial early on, setting up communities. But the long-term, sustained growth, that came mostly from informal person-to-person sharing.
Like within families and friendships?
Exactly. It spread through social networks. Someone converts. Maybe they're impressed by a Christian neighbor's behavior or their certainty, and then they share their new faith with their family, their friends, people they work with. It's more grassroots.
Makes sense.
And Ehrman points out the important role of women in these networks, often early converts within a household. And crucially, if the male head of the household converted.
Then the whole family often followed, including slaves.
Yes. That had a huge multiplying effect on the numbers over time.
What about miracles? We hear a lot about miracles in the New Testament. How important were those stories?
Hugely important, Ehrman argues. You have to remember the ancient mindset. People expected gods to do things, to show their power in the real world.
Like healing, protection, tangible stuff.
Exactly. Practical benefits. So early Christians claimed their God was more powerful than the pagan gods. And they had stories to back it up.
Jesus' miracles, the apostles doing wonders.
Right. And stories of ongoing miracles happening among believers. These weren't just like fairy tales. They were presented as proof. Evidence that their God was the real deal, the most powerful one.
So belief in these stories was a major draw.
A massive draw. Whether people saw something themselves or heard a convincing story from someone they trusted, it served as verification. It fit the ancient expectation of divine power manifesting. Ramsay McMullen emphasized this too, the importance of perceived power.
And Ehrman focuses on the belief in miracles being a driver, not necessarily verifying the miracles themselves historically.
Exactly. He's looking at the impact those beliefs had on conversion.
Okay, and we mentioned Paul briefly. Ehrman calls him maybe the most significant Christian convert of all time. Why such a strong claim?
Because Paul was absolutely pivotal in shifting Christianity from basically a Jewish sect into something potentially universal.
How did he do that?
His big theological move was arguing that Gentiles, non-Jews, could follow Christ without having to follow all the Jewish laws. Circumcision, dietary rules, things like that.
But that would have been a huge barrier for non-Jews.
Massive. By removing it, Paul essentially threw the doors open to the entire Roman Empire, the vast majority of whom were Gentiles. Plus, his missionary journeys established churches, created networks, he built the infrastructure for growth.
So exclusivity, evangelism, miracles, Paul's groundwork. Any other key factors Ehrman points to?
Yeah, a few others contribute. The promise of an afterlife, for instance,
Right.
specifically resurrection. That was pretty different from common pagan ideas focused more on this life, or Greek philosophical ideas about just the soul surviving.
And there was the flip side too, right? Eternal punishment.
Yes, the idea of judgment and potential damnation was also a powerful motivator, a sort of spiritual carrot and stick. Christianity also offered a pretty coherent worldview. You had the scriptures, the Hebrew Bible interpreted through Christ, plus the emerging New Testament writings. It gave people a unified story, creation, history, ethics.
Compared to maybe more fragmented pagan myths.
Perhaps, yeah. Paganism was diverse, localized. Christianity offered a more structured, universal system.
And what about the community aspect? The charity, caring for the poor and sick, was that a big draw?
This is where Ehrman offers a bit of a counter-argument, or at least a qualification.
Oh, how so?
He acknowledges the strong community bonds, mutual support, the ethical teachings about caring for the vulnerable within the Christian community. That was definitely there. But he pushes back against the idea, argued by scholars like Rodney Stark, that this charity was the main reason people converted in large numbers.
So it wasn't primarily about attracting people with social services.
Not in Ehrman's view. Not as the primary driver of initial conversion. He thinks the appeal of the powerful, exclusive God and the act of evangelism were more fundamental in bringing people in. The community and ethics were likely more important for keeping them, for retention, and maybe attracting some, but not the main engine of growth itself.
Interesting distinction. Okay, let's finally get to Constantine. We know Ehrman says he wasn't the sole cause, but what role did he play?
Constantine is the accelerator, the booster rocket. By the early 4th century, when he comes along, Christianity is already a significant minority, maybe poised for takeoff.
Already growing fast.
Right. Ehrman thinks it might well have become dominant eventually, even without Constantine, just based on the existing trends. But Constantine's conversion and support, that changed the game dramatically.
Ow!
It removed the threat of official persecution, which was huge. And it made being Christian suddenly advantageous, or at least respectable. Imperial favor opened a lot of doors.
But was Constantine's conversion real? Or just politics? That's always debated.
Yeah, and Ehrman leans towards genuine belief, though maybe a belief that developed over time and wasn't initially super theologically sophisticated.
What about the arguments against his sincerity? Pagan symbols on coins, ruthlessness, getting baptized only at the end?
Ehrman addressed those.
Yeah.
He argues the pagan symbols were common in that transitional period. Politics was brutal anyway, and deathbed baptism was actually quite normal. Then people wanted to wash away all their sins right at the end.
Okay.
And on the other side, you have Constantine ending persecution, pouring money into churches, getting involved in theological councils like Nicaea, actions that suggest a real commitment, even if a politically savvy one, too.
So his favor really kicked things into high gear.
Absolutely. The Edict of Milan in 313 ending persecution was the start. But then came legal privileges for clergy, huge financial patronage, integrating Christians into power structures. It made Christianity visible, powerful, and attractive in totally new ways. A snowball effect.
And didn't Emperor Julian try to reverse all this later? Julian the Apostate.
He did. Briefly, in the mid-4th century. He tried to revive paganism, restore the temples, create a kind of pagan church structure.
But it failed.
Yeah, he died young in battle. But Ehrman argues his failure shows just how entrenched Christianity had already become by then. Even with an emperor trying to push back, the momentum was too strong. It highlights how far Christianity had come.
Wow. So we've gone from this small, often persecuted group to the favored religion. How did that power shift affect how Christians treated pagans?
Oh, well, this is where the story takes a darker turn in some ways.
Oh, so?
Remember how Christians were accused of atheism, impiety, antisocial behavior?
Yeah.
Well, once Christianity gained power, especially with state backing, many of those same accusations started getting thrown back at the pagans. Their gods were denounced as demons, their rituals as immoral superstitions.
So the tables turned completely.
In many respects, yes. Ehrman describes how Christians began actively dismantling paganism. Temples were destroyed, like in Palmyra, or converted into churches. Statues were torn down.
And eventually, laws were passed against pagan practices.
Exactly. It started with restrictions, but eventually led to outright prohibition. The general religious pluralism of the Roman Empire, which had sort of allowed different faiths to coexist, really eroded once you had this exclusive monotheism backed by imperial power.
So that pagan tolerance, or maybe accommodation, didn't survive the Christian triumph.
It's complex. Paganism wasn't uniformly tolerant in our modern sense, but its structure allowed for coexistence in a way Christianity's exclusive claims didn't, especially once it had the power to enforce those claims. It became a one true religion situation, legally enforced over time.
Right. Okay, so wrapping up our look at Ehrman's triumph of Christianity, what are the big strengths you see in his analysis?
Well, first off, it's just incredibly readable. He takes this huge, complex story and makes it accessible, tells it like a compelling narrative. That's a real gift.
Yeah, he writes very clearly.
And he synthesizes so much information into this coherent framework. The core thesis, exclusivity plus evangelism, is powerful. It gives you a really solid, historically grounded way to understand how this improbable thing might have happened.
Makes a lot of sense. But like any historical argument, there are debates, right? Areas where other scholars might disagree.
Oh, absolutely. And we've touched on some. Did he downplay charity and community too much as growth factors? Are the demographic models reliable? How do we interpret tolerance or the role of miracle stories? His tone sometimes gets critiqued too.
Sure.
But these debates are healthy. They're how history moves forward. Different scholars weigh the evidence differently, emphasize different factors. It's a complex event. No single explanation will satisfy everyone.
So if we had to boil down Ehrman's main takeaway,
I'd say it's that Christianity's success wasn't primarily because of some outside event like Constantine, but because of its own internal DNA, that unique mix of demanding exclusive loyalty and being driven to convert everyone. That created the momentum.
And Constantine and imperial favor then acted like, well, rocket fuel on that existing momentum.
Exactly. A powerful amplifier.
Which really makes you think, doesn't it? What is it about any belief system, religious or secular, that helps it spread and stick around?
Right. And how much does the specific time and place, this social and political weather, matter in whether a movement catches fire or fizzles out?
Fascinating stuff to ponder. And if folks want to dig deeper, obviously reading Ehrman's The Triumph of Christianity is the first step.
Definitely. And checking out other historians we mentioned, Stark, McMullen, Peter Brown, gives you different angles on the same puzzle.
For sure. So a final thought to leave people with.
Maybe this. Thinking about Ehrman's focus on exclusivity and evangelism. Do we see similar dynamics driving other movements, even today? Political ideologies, social causes, maybe even brands? What can this ancient religious transformation teach us about belief, belonging, and how societies change fundamentally?